The first snowfall of October shouldn't have happened in Millbrook, Vermont, but there it was, turning Route 4 into a treacherous ribbon of ice. Jake Morrison was driving home from his daughter's parent-teacher conference when he spotted the overturned Tesla, its sleek black frame stark against the white birch trees. Steam rose from the crumpled hood as he approached, his work boots crunching through the fresh powder. Inside, a woman in a blood-stained designer's suit lay unconscious, her dark hair fanned across shattered glass. Without thinking, he pulled out the red knit scarf from his jacket, the last thing his late wife Sarah had made before cancer took her, and pressed it against the stranger's bleeding temple. When her eyes opened and locked onto his, she whispered something that made his blood freeze. He couldn't have known that this woman, bleeding in his arms, held the power to give him everything he'd lost, and he certainly couldn't have imagined why he would walk away from it all. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew your coffee order and your grandmother's maiden name. Population 3,000 on a good day, nestled between rolling hills that turned amber and crimson each fall. Jake Morrison had moved here 3 years ago with his 8-year-old daughter Emma, seeking the kind of peace that only small towns could offer. His wife Sarah had died 6 months before the move, and the city held too many memories of hospital corridors and sleepless nights. Here in Millbrook, Jake ran Morrison's garage on Main Street, fixing pickup trucks and lawnmowers for neighbors who paid in cash and homemade apple pie. The red brick building had been a hardware store in the 1950s, and Jake had kept the original tin ceiling and wood floors when he converted it into his workshop. Emma's drawings decorated the office walls, and a coffee pot that had seen better days gurgled constantly on a table made from sawhorses and plywood. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The woman who called herself Vicky claimed to be a marketing coordinator from Boston, traveling through Vermont when the early storm caught her off guard. She sat in the emergency room of Millbrook General Hospital, her expensive clothes replaced with scrubs, accepting Jake's offer to drive her to the local inn. "My car's totaled," she said, her voice carrying an accent that didn't quite match her story. "I'll need to stay a few days while insurance sorts everything out." Jake noticed how she observed everything during the short drive to Miller's Inn. The outdated medical equipment, the small-town newspaper headlines, the way the receptionist called everyone by their first name. Her eyes held the calculating gaze of someone who saw opportunity where others saw simplicity. When she asked about local businesses and employment rates, her questions felt more like market research than casual curiosity about her temporary home. At the inn, Mrs. Miller fussed over Vicky like a mother hen, offering homemade soup and extra blankets. "Poor dear," she murmured to Jake as they watched Vicky sign the register. "City folks aren't used to our Vermont winters." But Jake had noticed Vicky's expensive watch, the way she automatically reached for a phone that wasn't there, and the practiced ease with which she had deflected personal questions. Something about her didn't add up. The next morning, Vicky appeared at Morrison's garage carrying the red scarf, freshly laundered and folded with military precision. "I wanted to return this," she said, extending it toward Jake like an offering. "It meant something to you, didn't it?" The question was asked softly, without the prying tone of someone seeking gossip. Her brown eyes held genuine concern, and Jake found himself studying her face more carefully than he had the night before. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the scarf, remembering Sarah's fingers working the yarn during her final weeks of chemotherapy. "She made it for me," he said simply, not trusting himself to say more. The cable pattern was intricate, requiring hours of concentration that had helped Sarah focus on something besides the pain. It had taken her 3 months to finish, working between treatments and doctor appointments. Vicky nodded, her brown eyes softening with what looked like genuine understanding. She had beautiful hands, she observed, studying the intricate cable pattern. This took her months to finish. Something in her voice made Jake look up sharply. The comment was too specific, too knowledgeable. But Vicky had already turned her attention to his workspace, running her fingers along the edge of his tool bench with surprising familiarity. "You know something about knitting?" Jake asked, carefully folding the scarf and placing it in his jacket pocket. Vicky's hand stilled on the bench, and for a moment her carefully composed expression flickered. "My grandmother taught me," she said, but the answer came just a beat too slow. "I haven't done it in years, though, too busy with work." She gestured around the garage, clearly eager to change the subject. "This is a beautiful space. How long have you been in business?" Jake found himself giving her a tour, explaining how he had restored the building and built his customer base through word-of-mouth referrals. Vicky asked intelligent questions about overhead costs and seasonal fluctuations, displaying a business acumen that seemed far too sophisticated for someone in marketing coordination. When she suggested improvements to his workflow that would increase efficiency by 30%, Jake began to wonder exactly what kind of marketing she had been doing in Boston. Emma Morrison was not easily impressed by strangers, but Vicky won her over with tricks that seemed almost magical. During her second visit to the garage, she helped Emma with math homework while Jake worked on Sheriff Dawson's patrol car. "How did you know that 7 times 8 equals 56 so fast?" Emma asked, her pencil hovering over long division problems that had been frustrating her for an hour. "Mental math," Vicky replied, showing Emma shortcuts that made numbers dance in ways her third-grade teacher had never explained. She demonstrated how to break large numbers into smaller, manageable pieces, then recombine them using patterns that seemed obvious once explained. Emma's eyes lit up as concepts that had seemed impossible suddenly made sense. "It's like a secret code," she exclaimed, attacking her homework with renewed enthusiasm. Jake watched from beneath the hood of the patrol car, noting how Vicky's explanations used terms like algorithms and computational thinking, language that seemed far too sophisticated for a marketing coordinator. When Emma asked Vicky about her job in Boston, the woman's answer came just a beat too slow, as if she were consulting an internal script. "I help companies figure out what customers want," she said vaguely. "It involves a lot of research and analysis." "Do you like it?" Emma pressed, with the relentless curiosity of childhood. Vicky was quiet for a long moment, staring at the math problems scattered across the desk. "I used to think I did," she said finally, "but lately I've been wondering if there might be something better out there." The wistfulness in her voice made Jake pause in his work, and he found himself listening more carefully to the conversation happening at his makeshift desk. The garage became Vicky's unofficial second home over the following week. She claimed to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere while waiting for her replacement vehicle, but Jake noticed how she studied his repair processes with the intensity of an engineer. She knew the difference between metric and standard tools without being told, could identify engine problems by sound alone, and once prevented him from making a costly mistake by pointing out a hairline crack in a cylinder head that he had missed. When Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick developed a mysterious electrical problem that had stumped Jake for 2 days, Vicky suggested checking the ground wire connections in a specific sequence that solved the issue immediately. "Lucky guess," she said when Jake raised his eyebrows, but her hands had moved with the confidence of someone who had intimate knowledge of automotive electrical systems. Her questions about the garage's business operations, cash flow, customer retention, expansion possibilities, felt more like market research than casual curiosity. "You seem to know a lot about cars for someone in marketing," Jake observed one afternoon as they shared coffee and donuts from Baker's Dozen down the street. Vicky's cup paused halfway to her lips, and he saw that telltale flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "I had a boyfriend in college who was an engineering major," she said carefully. "I picked up a few things hanging around his workshop." But the explanation felt rehearsed, and Jake found himself wondering what else she might be hiding. One evening, as autumn deepened into the kind of cold that promised an early winter, Jake found Vicky sitting on his front porch steps when he returned from picking up Emma from soccer practice. She wore jeans and a borrowed sweater from Mrs. Miller, looking more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. The porch light cast shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion she had been hiding behind careful makeup and professional composure. "The inn is nice," she said, wrapping her arms around her knees like a shield, "but it's lonely eating dinner by yourself every night." Her voice carried a note of sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than temporary displacement. Jake hesitated, thinking of the extra place setting that had remained unused for 3 years, the dining room table that seemed too large for just him and Emma. The smart thing would be to maintain boundaries, to keep this mysterious woman at arm's length until her business in Millbrook was finished. But something in her posture, the way she held herself like someone trying not to take up too much space, reminded him of Emma during those first difficult months after Sarah's death. "Emma's been asking when you're coming for dinner," he said, which was true enough. His daughter had mentioned Vicky at least once during every meal that week, wondering aloud why nice people had to eat alone when there was plenty of room at their table. Over pot roast and mashed potatoes, Vicky listened to Emma's stories about school with the attention of someone starved for normal family conversation. She helped clear dishes without being asked, knew instinctively that Jake took his coffee black while Emma preferred milk with just a touch of cocoa powder, and somehow transformed their quiet dinner routine into something that felt dangerously close to complete. When Emma asked if Vicky would read her bedtime story, Jake found himself holding his breath until she said yes. After Emma was tucked into bed, Jake and Vicky sat on the front porch, drinking coffee and watching the stars emerge over Millbrook's quiet streets. "Tell me about your family," Jake said, genuinely curious about the woman who had somehow become part of their evening routine. Vicky was quiet for so long that he wondered if she had heard the question. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "There isn't much to tell. My parents died when I was young, and I was raised by my grandmother until she passed away during my senior year of college." She sipped her coffee, staring into the darkness beyond the porch light. "I've been on my own ever since. Work became everything because there wasn't anything else." The simple statement held years of loneliness, and Jake found himself wanting to ask more questions while simultaneously respecting her obvious desire for privacy. "That sounds like a hard way to live," he said instead, thinking about the community that had embraced him and Emma when they needed it most. Vicky turned to look at him, and in the dim light he could see something that looked like surprise in her eyes. "Most people think independence is admirable," she said. "The ability to rely only on yourself, to make your own success without depending on anyone else." "Independence is one thing," Jake replied, watching a neighbor's cat pick its way across the frost-covered lawn. "Isolation is something else entirely. People aren't meant to go through life alone." He thought about the meals shared with neighbors, the way Mrs. Henderson checked on Emma when he had to work late, the informal network of support that had made single parenthood manageable. Community matters, family matters, even when it's not the family you were born with. The first crack in Vicky's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when her phone rang during lunch. Jake was replacing brake pads on the town sheriff's cruiser when he heard her voice change completely. Crisp, authoritative, and speaking in rapid-fire technical jargon that made his blood run cold. "The Q3 projections are unacceptable," she was saying. "Market penetration in the Northeast Corridor is below threshold, and if we can't achieve better positioning by year-end, the board will start asking questions none of us want to answer." She ended the call quickly when she noticed him listening, but not before Jake caught the name Tech Flow and felt his world tilt off its axis. The wrench slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent silence. Tech Flow Industries, the name that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. The company that had destroyed his career and contributed to his wife's death through months of legal stress and character assassination. Jake continued working on the brake system with hands that suddenly felt unsteady, his mind racing back to a conference room in Boston where that same company name had been stamped on termination papers and non-disclosure agreements. The coincidence seemed impossible, but pieces were starting to form a picture that made his chest tight with old anger and fresh betrayal. Victoria, whoever she really was, had been lying to him from the moment they met. That night, Jake sat in his workshop after Emma had gone to bed, turning a wrench over and over in his hands while trying to make sense of what he had heard. TechFlow Industries had been the technology startup where he had worked as a senior engineer, developing revolutionary battery management systems that promised to change how electric vehicles stored and used power. He had loved that job, believed in the company's mission to create sustainable transportation solutions, and trusted his colleagues like family. Right up until the day he discovered they were stealing intellectual property from smaller competitors, using his algorithms to reverse engineer patents belonging to companies that couldn't afford to fight back in court. The theft was systematic and sophisticated, hidden behind layers of shell companies and falsified research documents. When Jake had tried to blow the whistle, TechFlow's legal team had destroyed him systematically, questioning his mental stability, his loyalty, his competence as an engineer and a husband. The stress had accelerated Sarah's cancer, or at least that's what Jake believed during the long nights when he watched her struggle with treatments that seemed less effective with each passing month. She died believing her husband was a failure who couldn't provide for his family, and Jake had carried that guilt like a stone in his chest ever since. The fact that Vicky worked for the same company that had destroyed his life felt like the universe's idea of a cruel joke. Jake spent the following day watching Vicky with new eyes, cataloging the small signs he had missed before. The way she instinctively understood complex technical problems, her familiarity with business terminology that should have been outside her supposed area of expertise, the expensive clothes she tried to hide beneath borrowed sweaters and work shirts. Most damning of all was her obvious comfort with authority, the unconscious assumption that her suggestions would be followed and her questions answered. The confrontation came the following evening, when Vicky arrived for dinner carrying grocery bags and wearing an expression that suggested she knew the game was almost over. She had brought ingredients for Emma's favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread, and moved around Jake's kitchen with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. But Jake waited until Emma was absorbed in homework before speaking, his voice carefully controlled despite 3 years of suppressed rage. "I know who you are," he said quietly, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Victoria Chen, Chief Executive Officer of TechFlow Industries." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation, and Jake watched Vicky's hands still on the pasta she was preparing. When she turned around, her face had transformed into something he barely recognized. Gone was the soft vulnerability he had grown to care for, replaced by the calculating intelligence of a woman who had built a technology empire before her 30th birthday. "How long have you known?" she asked, her Boston accent now perfectly crisp and professional. The transformation was so complete that Jake wondered if anything about the woman he had been falling in love with was real. The thought made his chest tight with a pain that had nothing to do with old grievances and everything to do with fresh betrayal since yesterday. "The question is, why are you here? What kind of sick game is this?" Jake's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm, and he saw Emma's head lift from her homework in the next room. The sight of his daughter's concerned face reminded him that their drama was playing out in a home where a little girl was trying to feel safe, and he forced himself to lower his voice. Victoria moved closer, lowering her voice to match his, but her posture remained straight and uncompromising. "It's not a game, Jake. I came to Millbrook to scout locations for a new data center, but I had no idea you lived here. The accident was real, and everything that happened after—" She paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate for the situation. "Everything I've felt these past 2 weeks has been real." Jake laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the warm kitchen that had become a sanctuary for all of them. "Felt? You destroyed my life. You killed my wife as surely as if you had pulled a trigger." The accusation was unfair, and he knew it. Sarah's cancer had been diagnosed before the TechFlow scandal, but 3 years of grief and anger had found their target. "And now you want to destroy this town too, turn it into another monument to corporate greed." The words hit Victoria like physical blows, and Jake saw her carefully maintained composure crack. "I didn't know about Sarah," she whispered, her professional facade crumbling. "I didn't know she had died. I thought you had just moved on, found another job, rebuilt your life somewhere else." Her voice broke on the last words, and for a moment she looked like the vulnerable woman who had shared dinners with his family, not the corporate executive who had signed his termination papers. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her homework forgotten, sensing the adult tension that filled the room like smoke. "Dad, is everything okay?" she asked in the small voice she had used during Sarah's final hospital stay, when grown-ups spoke in hushed tones and wore expressions that promised bad news. Jake forced his expression to soften, but Victoria was the one who answered, kneeling down to Emma's level with practiced ease. "Your dad and I are just talking about some grown-up things, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Why don't you go get ready for bed? I'll come read you a story in a few minutes." Emma looked between them uncertainly, her 8-year-old intuition picking up on currents she couldn't understand, then walked to Victoria and hugged her waist with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "I love you, Vicky," she said simply, the words hitting both adults like a physical blow. After Emma disappeared upstairs, Victoria sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her perfect composure finally shattering. "I didn't know about Sarah," she repeated, as if saying it again might somehow change the past. "When the whistleblower allegations came out, I was in Singapore closing an acquisition deal. By the time I got back to Boston, the legal team had already handled everything." The full truth came out in fragments over the next hour, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for 3 years. Victoria explained how she had inherited tech flow from her mentor, Richard Blackstone, a man she had trusted completely until she discovered the extent of his corporate espionage after his death from a sudden heart attack. "I found the files in his private office," she said, tears cutting tracks through her makeup. "Patents stolen from dozens of smaller companies, research bought from corrupt employees, entire product lines built on theft. I've spent the last 2 years trying to clean up the mess he left behind," she continued, her voice hollow with exhaustion, "making restitution to the companies we stole from, firing everyone who was involved, rebuilding the company's culture from the ground up. But I never knew about the personal cost to the whistleblowers. The legal team told me they were corporate spies, trying to steal our intellectual property. I never saw the psychological evaluations, never knew about the character assassination campaigns." Jake found himself caught between his desire for revenge and his growing understanding that the woman sitting across from him was as much a victim as he was. "The data center project," he said finally, his voice raw from shouting. "You're going to destroy Millbrook to build another monument to technology." The town had become his refuge, the place where he and Emma had learned to heal, and the thought of losing it to corporate development felt like a second betrayal. Victoria shook her head slowly, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I canceled the project yesterday. Before you figured out who I was, before this conversation, I couldn't bear the thought of destroying something so beautiful." She gestured around the kitchen, with its mismatched chairs and Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator. "These past 2 weeks have been the first time I've felt like a real person instead of a corporate entity. Do you know how long it's been since someone hugged me just because they wanted to?" The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway interrupted their conversation, followed by authoritative knocking that made Victoria's face go pale. Jake opened the front door to find Marcus Webb, TechFlow's head legal counsel, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they had stepped out of a corporate thriller. Marcus was exactly as Jake remembered him, silver-haired, predatory, with the kind of smile that promised pain to anyone who stood in his way. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said with the cold smile Jake remembered from depositions and court hearings. "We're here for Ms. Chen. The board of directors has some concerns about her recent decisions." His gaze flicked past Jake to where Victoria stood in the kitchen doorway, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear in her eyes. "I trust you've been taking good care of our missing CEO?" Victoria appeared behind Jake, her spine straightening as she faced the men who had come to collect her like wayward property. "I told you the Millbrook project was canceled," she said, her voice steady despite everything that had just happened. "The board accepted my recommendation 2 days ago." But Marcus's smile widened, and Jake could see that Victoria's confidence was about to be shattered. "Actually, the board voted to override your decision in an emergency session this morning," Marcus said smoothly, producing an envelope from his briefcase with the theatrical flair of a magician. "And since you've been unreachable for 2 weeks, they've asked me to deliver some paperwork regarding your employment status." He handed the envelope to Victoria with mock courtesy, and Jake watched her face drain of color as she read the contents. The legal documents were a masterwork of corporate brutality, effectively stripping Victoria of her position while binding her to a non-compete clause that would prevent her from working anywhere in the technology sector for 5 years. "Of course, these could all be reconsidered if you were to sign the Millbrook contracts," Marcus added smoothly. "The board is prepared to be generous to former employees who remain cooperative." The threat was clear: submit to their demands or face professional exile. Jake found himself stepping protectively in front of Victoria, a gesture that surprised them both. "She said no," he said firmly, His mechanic's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I think you heard her the first time." Marcus turned his predatory attention to Jake, his expression shifting to something that looked almost pleased, as if he had been hoping for this exact confrontation. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Still fighting losing battles, I see. How is small-town life treating you? I imagine it's quite a come-down from your previous career in advanced battery technology." The casual cruelty of the comment was designed to wound, and Jake felt his temper flare despite his efforts to stay calm. "Better than being a corporate vulture," Jake shot back, but Marcus just laughed. "Such hostility. And after Techful has been so generous with your severance package—" "Oh, wait. That's right, you didn't receive a severance package, did you? Just a termination for cause and a recommendation that other companies avoid hiring you for security reasons." The reminder of his professional destruction was meant to put Jake in his place, but it had the opposite effect. What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Victoria herself. She stepped around Jake, her spine straightening as she faced the men who had come to destroy what remained of her independence. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms filled with men twice her age, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. As Chen, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation," Marcus began, but Victoria held up her hand with the imperious gesture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The transformation was remarkable. The vulnerable woman who had shared pot roast dinners with his family had become someone who could bring down a billion-dollar corporation with a phone call. "I have copies of every email, every document, every recorded conversation from Richard Blackstone's files," she said, her voice never wavering, "including the ones that detail exactly how Techflow acquired its most profitable patents through corporate espionage, employee bribery, and systematic theft of intellectual property." Marcus's confident expression faltered slightly, and Jake saw uncertainty creep into the lawyer's calculating eyes. "I think you're bluffing," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Victoria smiled, and Jake saw glimpses of the formidable executive she had been before guilt and isolation had driven her to this small Vermont town. "Am I? Would you like me to start with the Morrison case? I have the complete file, including the psychological evaluations your team fabricated, the medical records you illegally obtained, and the witness statements you coerced through financial intimidation." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Emma's footsteps upstairs as she got ready for bed. Jake watched this corporate showdown with growing amazement, finally understanding the full scope of Victoria's power and the courage it took for her to walk away from it. But he also saw the cost. The way her hands shook slightly despite her steady voice, the exhaustion in her eyes that spoke of battles fought in boardrooms and courtrooms, where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. "Here's what's going to happen," Victoria continued, her voice as cold and precise as a surgical instrument. "You're going to tear up those papers and drive back to Boston. The Millbrook project stays canceled permanently, and Techflow will issue formal apologies and financial compensation to every person whose life you destroyed with fraudulent evidence and character assassination." Marcus attempted to interrupt, but Victoria's raised hand silenced him again. "I'm not finished," she said, with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Jake Morrison will receive a settlement of $500,000 and a public acknowledgement that his termination was unjustified and based on falsified evidence. Mrs. Sarah Morrison's medical expenses, which were exacerbated by the stress of your legal campaign, will be paid in full with interest. And if the board has any problem with these terms, I'll be happy to discuss the matter with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and every technology journalist from here to Silicon Valley." Jake felt his knees go weak as he processed what Victoria was offering. Not just financial compensation, but public vindication, and Sarah's medical bills, which had haunted him for 3 years. The money would secure Emma's college education and allow him to expand the garage, but more importantly, it would clear his name and honor Sarah's memory. He looked at Victoria with new eyes, seeing not just the corporate executive but the woman who was willing to sacrifice everything to make things right. Marcus and his associates exchanged glances, clearly conducting a silent conference about damage control and acceptable losses. Finally, Marcus pulled out his phone and walked to the far end of the porch, speaking in urgent whispers to whoever answered his call. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, punctuated by increasingly heated exchanges that carried clearly in the cold night air. When Marcus returned, his predatory smile had been replaced by the tight expression of someone who had just lost a high-stakes negotiation. "The board accepts your terms," he said through gritted teeth, "contingent on your signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding all TechFlow business practices, past and present." He produced new documents from his briefcase, these ones considerably shorter and less aggressive than the termination papers. "Agreed," Victoria said without hesitation, "with one additional condition. TechFlow will establish a whistleblower protection fund to provide legal and financial support for employees who report corporate misconduct. The fund will be administered by an independent third party and funded with $10 million annually for the next 5 years. The demand was audacious, and Jake saw Marcus's jaw clench with barely suppressed rage. "That's acceptable," Marcus said finally, clearly communicating with his superiors through some invisible signal. "The paperwork will be completed within 48 hours, and Mr. Morrison's settlement will be transferred immediately upon execution." He gathered his documents with sharp, angry movements, his professional composure cracking under the strain of unconditional surrender. As Marcus and his associates prepared to leave, he turned back to Victoria with one final attempt at intimidation. "You realize this means exile from the technology industry," he said. "No major corporation will hire you after this, and starting your own company will be nearly impossible without connections and capital." But Victoria just smiled, the expression genuinely peaceful for the first time since Jake had known her. "Good," she said simply. "I'm tired of being the kind of person who has to worry about things like that." Marcus left without another word, taking his contracts and his threats with him, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Jake and Victoria stood in his kitchen, like strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "You didn't have to do that," Jake said finally, his voice hoarse with emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. "You gave up everything, your career, your company, your entire life." Victoria shook her head, settling back into the chair where she had eaten countless meals with his family, looking smaller now that the corporate armor had been stripped away. "I didn't give up everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave up the things that were destroying me from the inside, the guilt, the isolation, the constant pressure to be someone I never wanted to be." She looked around the kitchen, with its mismatched chairs and Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, as if memorizing every detail. "These past 2 weeks have been the first time I've felt like a real person, instead of a corporate entity." The sound of Emma's footsteps on the stairs reminded them both that their drama was playing out in a home where a little girl was trying to sleep. Emma appeared in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes and looking concerned about the late-night visitors and hushed conversations. "Why were those men here?" she asked, unconsciously moving closer to Victoria for comfort. "They look scary, like the men in suits on TV shows." Victoria knelt down to Emma's level, her expression gentle despite everything that had just happened. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about work," she said carefully, choosing words that would reassure rather than frighten. "But everything's okay now. They won't be coming back, and you don't need to worry about them." She smoothed Emma's hair with the practiced gesture of someone who had learned to love this child completely. Emma studied Victoria's face, with the intuitive wisdom of children who have learned to read adult emotions for signs of impending loss. "You're not going away, are you?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "You're not going to leave like Mommy did?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, and Jake felt his heart break for both of them. His daughter, who had already lost one mother, and Victoria, who had found the family she had never known she wanted. Victoria looked at Jake over Emma's head, asking a question with her eyes that he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. 3 years of grief and anger warred with 2 weeks of growing feelings he had thought were dead forever. But as he watched Victoria comfort his daughter, saw the genuine love in her eyes and the way Emma instinctively trusted her, Jake realized that some decisions made themselves. "That depends," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "on whether you want to stay." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them with an expression of hope he had never seen before. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, her professional mask finally completely gone. "TechFlow was my whole life. I don't know how to be anything else." Jake thought about second chances and the red scarf upstairs in his dresser drawer, the one Sarah had knitted while talking about forgiveness and letting go of anger. He thought about the settlement money that would secure Emma's future and the vindication that would finally lay Sarah's memory to rest. But mostly he thought about the woman kneeling beside his daughter, who had given up everything to make amends for crimes she hadn't committed. "Maybe it's time you learned," he said, reaching for her hand and feeling the calluses that had developed from 2 weeks of honest work. "We could figure it out together." Victoria's smile transformed her entire face, erasing years of corporate stress and isolation, and when Emma hugged them both with the fierce joy of a child whose prayers had been answered, Jake knew they had found something worth more than all the patents and legal settlements in the world. 6 months later, spring came early to Millbrook, bringing with it the kind of renewal that small towns celebrated with maple syrup festivals and community garden plantings. Jake stood in the doorway of Morrison's garage, watching Victoria teach Emma how to change the oil in Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick. The garage had expanded to include the building next door, creating space for Victoria's technology consulting business and a proper office where Emma could do homework after school. Victoria had traded her designer suits for coveralls and work boots, though she still moved with the precision of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions. The settlement money from TechFlow had allowed them to modernize the garage's equipment and hire 2 part-time employees, but the real changes were harder to quantify. The way Victoria hummed while cooking dinner, the easy intimacy of shared morning coffee, the sound of Emma's laughter filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long. "Hand me that wrench, Em," Victoria said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had learned to find joy in small accomplishments. Emma complied with the serious concentration of a student eager to learn, and Jake marveled at how naturally they had fallen into the rhythm of family life. Victoria had adapted to small-town routines with the same intensity she had once brought to corporate acquisitions, joining the school board and volunteering at the annual Harvest Festival. The technology consulting business had grown organically, as word spread about the former CEO who could explain complex concepts to farmers and shop owners who had never owned a computer. Victoria helped local businesses set up simple websites, taught senior citizens how to video chat with grandchildren, and consulted with regional manufacturers about automation and efficiency improvements. It was work that mattered in ways that quarterly profit reports never had. Emma had blossomed under Victoria's attention, her math grades improving dramatically and her confidence growing with each passing week. "Mom, Vicky says I could be an engineer like she used to be," Emma had announced one evening, the casual use of the title making both adults pause with emotion. Victoria had never asked Emma to call her mom, but the 8-year-old had made the decision herself, explaining that, "Mommy Sarah will always be my first mom, but Mom Vicky is my now mom." Victoria had learned to knit, though her scarves bore little resemblance to Sarah's intricate patterns. "Practice makes perfect," she would say, examining her uneven stitches with the same analytical mind that had once optimized supply chains and maximized market penetration. Jake kept Sarah's red scarf in his dresser drawer, carefully preserved alongside their wedding photos and Emma's baby pictures, but Victoria's imperfect attempts at the craft had created new traditions that honored the past while embracing the future. On a warm evening in May, Jake found Victoria sitting on their front porch swing, working on a small red scarf that was clearly meant for Emma. The sight of her hands moving yarn in patterns similar to Sarah's made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to navigate. The evening air carried the scent of apple blossoms from the neighbor's orchard, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower provided the steady soundtrack of suburban contentment. "Penny for your thoughts," Victoria said without looking up from her knitting, her fingers working the yarn with increasing confidence. The phrase was one Sarah had used often, and hearing it from Victoria's lips created a bridge between past and present that felt both natural and profound. Jake settled beside her on the swing, the old chains creaking under their combined weight, in a rhythm that matched his heart. "Just thinking about second chances," Jake replied, watching the way the porch light caught the auburn highlights in Victoria's hair. about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads to the best thing. The observation felt both profound and simple, like most truths that took years to understand. Victoria's hands stilled on her knitting, and she turned to look at him with the directness that had first caught his attention in the wreckage of her car. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice carrying 3 years of guilt and 6 months of hope. "Letting me stay after everything Taklo did to you? Everything I represented?" The question held layers of meaning, about forgiveness and trust, about the courage required to love someone whose past was tangled with your greatest pain. Jake considered his answer carefully, knowing that some moments demanded complete honesty. "The only thing I regret," he said, taking the knitting from her hands and setting it aside on the small table that held their evening coffee cups, "is how long it took me to realize that Sarah would have liked you." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them with an expression of wonder that suggested she had never expected such acceptance. "How can you be sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake thought about his wife's favorite saying, the one she had repeated during her final weeks when pain medication made her philosophical about forgiveness and second chances. Because she always said that love isn't about replacing what you've lost, it's about making room for what you've found. The words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, lessons learned through grief and healing that had prepared him for this moment. He pulled the small velvet box from his pocket, the one he had been carrying for weeks while working up the courage for this conversation. "Victoria Chen," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple vintage ring from Anderson's jewelry downtown. "Will you marry a small-town mechanic and help him raise a little girl who already thinks you hung the moon?" The proposal was unadorned by grand gestures or elaborate speeches, but it carried the sincerity of a man who had learned to value substance over style, commitment over passion, the quiet strength of daily love over dramatic declarations. The ring was modest, a vintage piece with a small diamond surrounded by delicate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship from an earlier era. It was nothing like the corporate excess that had once defined Victoria's world, but when she said yes through happy tears, Jake knew they had both found something worth more than all the technology patents and legal settlements in the world. Her acceptance felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been 3 years in the making. Emma's delighted squeal from the kitchen window indicated she had been eavesdropping, and within minutes the entire Morrison Chen household was celebrating on the front porch, while neighbors gathered to offer congratulations. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade cookies still warm from the oven. Sheriff Dawson offered to provide security for the wedding, and even the mailman stopped his truck to join the impromptu party that spilled onto the sidewalk and across the street. It was exactly the kind of scene Victoria had once viewed with bemused detachment during her corporate years, when community celebrations seemed quaint and inefficient compared to business dinners and networking events. Now she couldn't imagine wanting anything else. The genuine warmth of people who celebrated each other's joy simply because it was the right thing to do. The easy intimacy of a place where everyone knew your story and loved you anyway. The wedding planning began immediately, with Emma appointed as chief consultant and the entire town of Millbrook volunteering their services. Mrs. Miller offered the inn's garden for the reception, Pastor Williams cleared his calendar for the ceremony, and the ladies' auxiliary took charge of flowers and decorations with the efficiency of a military operation. Victoria found herself swept into a whirlwind of small-town enthusiasm that left her feeling more connected to community than any corporate retreat or team-building exercise ever had. As summer approached and the wedding date was set for September, Victoria established new routines that honored both her past expertise and her future commitments. She kept a small office in Boston for consulting work that couldn't be done remotely, but Millbrook had become home in ways she had never expected. The data center project had been permanently canceled, with TechFlow issuing a public statement about corporate responsibility and community preservation that Victoria had written herself. Other technology companies had approached the town with similar proposals over the months that followed, drawn by Vermont's reliable power grid and tax incentives for data infrastructure. But the residents had politely declined each offer, preferring their maple trees to server farms and their seasonal rhythms to the 24/7 demands of digital commerce. "Some things," Mayor Collins had said at the town meeting, "are worth more than the money they could bring." The red scarf Sarah had knitted remained in Jake's dresser drawer, carefully preserved alongside their wedding photos and Emma's baby pictures. But Victoria's imperfect attempts at knitting had created new traditions that connected past and present, and Emma now owned 3 slightly lopsided scarves in different shades of blue and green. Mom Sarah's scarf was perfect because she made it with perfect love, Emma had explained to Victoria one evening while modeling her latest gift. But your scarves are special because you're learning love, and that's harder. The wisdom of 8-year-olds continued to surprise them both, and Jake often found himself marveling at how his daughter had adapted to their expanded family with the resilience of someone who understood that love comes in many forms. Emma had created her own rituals around both mothers, telling Sarah's picture about her school day each morning and asking Victoria to braid her hair before bed. The balance felt natural rather than forced, a testament to the child's innate understanding that honoring the past didn't require limiting the future. On their wedding day in September, Victoria walked down the aisle of Millbrook Community Church wearing Sarah's red scarf over her simple white dress, a gesture that had been Emma's idea and Jake's blessing. The ceremony was small, attended by everyone in town who could fit in the tiny church, with Emma serving as maid of honor and ring-bearer combined in a pink dress that matched her radiant smile. Pastor Williams kept his remarks brief, focusing on second chances and the mysterious ways that love finds us when we least expect it. When Jake and Victoria exchanged vows they had written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and even Sheriff Dawson was seen wiping his face with his uniform sleeve. The vows spoke of forgiveness and growth, of family built through choice rather than circumstance, of love that encompasses loss without being diminished by it. The reception took place in Morrison's garage, transformed for the evening with string lights and homemade decorations that Victoria would have once hired event planners to create. The space that had become the foundation of their relationship now hosted their celebration, with Emma's artwork hanging alongside marriage certificates and business licenses in a collage that told the story of their unconventional family. Victoria danced with Jake to a song Emma had chosen, something about coming home that made everyone cry again, and ate wedding cake made by the church ladies' auxiliary from a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations. She received marriage advice from farmers and shop owners who had learned to see past her former life to the woman she had become, and found herself part of a community that measured success in different terms than quarterly earnings and market share. "Welcome to the family," Mrs. Henderson whispered during their dance. And Victoria realized that family now meant more than blood relations or corporate hierarchies. It meant belonging somewhere, completely, scars and imperfections included, accepted not despite your past mistakes but because of how you chose to address them. The settlement money had secured their financial future, but this acceptance was worth more than any bank account. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Jake and Victoria stood in their decorated garage, holding hands and watching Emma help clean up, with the energy of someone who had eaten too much cake and stayed up past her bedtime. The fairy lights twinkled overhead like stars, and the sound of laughter echoed off the walls, where Jake had once worked alone, nursing grief and anger that had seemed insurmountable. "No regrets?" Jake asked, echoing Victoria's question from months earlier, his voice soft with contentment. "Only one," Victoria replied, smiling, as Emma tried to fold chairs that were taller than she was with the determination of someone who refused to admit defeat. "I wish we could do it all over again, just to see the look on Marcus Webb's face when he gets our wedding announcement." They laughed together, 2 people who had found their way back from betrayal and loss to something neither had thought possible. The garage around them held the tools of Jake's trade and the remnants of their celebration, but more importantly, it contained the evidence of transformation. From corporate executive to small-town consultant, from grieving widower to hopeful husband, from broken family to something beautifully whole. And in the soft glow of string lights and the sound of their daughter's laughter, they began the next chapter of a story that had started with a car accident and ended with a family. The red scarf that had bound Jake's wound had become the thread that wove their lives together, proving that sometimes the most unlikely rescues save more than just a life. They saved the possibility of love itself.